This program is sponsored in part by the National Catholic Society of Foresters. Hello again and welcome to Looking at Social Justice. I'm Jim Grant and I am so pleased today to have another guest from the Civic Education Center. You may remember a while back we had Dr. John Minkler, and we talked about this exciting program that he and Dr. Stephen Morris have worked on together for a good time. We had a talk about what they did on that evening when all these young students from across the county were sharing their excitement for civics and how they are finding projects to do to show justice right here in the Valley. Well, today we have Dr. Stephen Morris, who is independently going to share with us around three themes: civic education, race, and equity. It could take hours and hours, Stephen, but why don't we open up with, tell us a little bit about how you and John do work together, but then introduce us to some of the things that you personally want to highlight around those three things: civic education and justice, but also race and equity. Introduce us to yourself and your work, Stephen.
Oh, very good. I grew up in Wichita, Kansas, in a Catholic parish of Holy Savior. And I remember being about 7 years old, and Father John Rinkemeyer had just come in from Central America as a missionary priest. And he moved right in our town, and the church was on the border of black and white community. At that time, Wichita was very segregated. And Holy Savior was trying to integrate, this was in the 60s, right?
Oh my God.
Trying to integrate by bringing in white parishioners into a black neighborhood at a predominantly black church. And so Father John brought in Father Tom Scaletti, got to know them. They got to, well, the police were always at our house, right? And so Father John would always come down with the police and say, we know the family. And, you know, they helped my mom, single parent. They helped put in windows at Christmas, since when our windows were broken, you know, and it's cold in Kansas. They brought food down, and then they got us enrolled in Holy Savior after we got kicked out of the public school. My brother and I, and they paid for our tuition and ended up going to Catholic high school at Cape and Mount Carmel there. And Father Whalen and I were having this discussion about wine and communion. And I said, you give us communion every day, but you don't give us wine. So with the seniors, he provided wine at our next communion. So I have this background of social justice related to growing up as a Catholic in an inner city neighborhood.
I had no idea that we were going to begin with something back in Kansas, but we're not in Kansas
We're
anymore.
not in Kansas anymore, no.
We are here.
Yes,
And
yes.
how did what you experienced in Kansas prepare you for what you do as a doctor working with students on these very topics that you grew up involved in and suffering from?
Yes, I think that was the point with Father John and Father Tom gave me this concept that God is concerned about more than just your spiritual well-being, but it impacts your daily lives. It impacts how you live and how you respond in the community. And as I grew up, that became my passion, this desire to want to give back. Even when I joined the Black Panthers, right? This idea of giving back and being involved in the community was something that was put in my heart back in my days with Father John and Father Tom. And so we had to reconcile this radical militancy that I was growing up in the Panthers. I learned how to make Molotov cocktails. We participated in a few riots, and I'd go to confession. And I'd have these great talks with Father John. You know, he came out of Central America, and he talked about the turbulence there and social justice and at that time. And so we had a pretty good bond, you know, growing up. That brought me into college, where I graduated with a degree in social work because I wanted to give back and help and have people tackle complicated issues that we avoid in life. Father John and Father Tom never steered away from difficult conversations. I can remember when Blessed Sacrament was struggling with having some of their white parishioners come to Holy Savior, and they jumped in the middle of it again, 60s and 70s, and talked about this idea of God being a God of all, and he being more concerned with our heart. And racism is just as much of a sin as adultery. Now, this was Father John and Father Tom in the 60s and 70s that were talking about this. So it was a very powerful message for me growing up in an all-black community and having these white Italian priests from Central America in our community, right? And so having that in my background and seeing this idea of how to perform social justice with still understanding that God cares about this through my radical time with the Black Panthers, graduated from college, worked with a nonprofit organization that worked with kids right in the neighborhood where I grew up in. And I got to teach them principles from the Word of God. I got to talk to them about morals, about life, about overcoming your circumstances that you encounter. And then I was asked to come out to Los Angeles and work in Watts with predominantly black kids and families in Watts. And so moved our family out from Kansas, from the plains of Kansas, to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. Talking about culture shock.
I almost am on a ride now that I have no idea where it's going because it's taken us from the tornado of, well, it wasn't a tornado, but Kansas, and then we go to Black Panthers, then we go to Watts. How did you eventually end up in Fresno doing what you're doing now?
Excellent, yes.
This is amazing.
Because of the work we were doing in LA, a group of pastors came to LA and asked if we could do the same thing in Fresno. So through some prayer and some, counseling and advice, we moved to Fresno back in 1980 and began working with children and families here, and did that for 10 years. And then I decided it was time for me to retire from this work. And so Dr. Floyd Buchanan found me and said, Morris, you need to go into public education if you really want to make a difference. And so he hooked me up with Dr. Joe Lee, and I began working out in West Fresno. And that's where I met John Minkler. And I was running the state and federal programs over there, one particular called Healthy Start and Even Start. And John and I got together and decided to do a project of integrating the curriculum the kids were doing in math, science, ELA, English Language Arts, with community service projects. John called it service learning. Now, this was in '96. And so in '96, we formed a project that became a model for the state of California on having 8th grade students from a predominantly black middle school in West Fresno work with senior citizens through the United Way and RSVP Retired and Senior Volunteer Program to bring smoke detectors through the fire department into their homes. And it tied in with their core curriculum. So that's how I met John and got to doing all that.
Which school was it in West Fresno?
It was called West Fresno Elementary School at the time. And I think it's just called West Fresno School now. Over there, they just unified with Washington Union. But we did this project. Delane Easton invited us to help write the standards for service learning to create the framework for California. So John and I did that, and our paths just kept crossing. And then I became principal at Carver Middle School in Fresno Unified.
Our sons went to Carver.
No way, did
yes
they?
Way.
Oh my goodness, how cool.
Back in the day.
Yes.
This was a choice we made. When were you there?
Oh, I was there in 2005 to 2012, somewhere around there.
They were
About
gone.
7 years.
They had
Okay,
graduated,
yes.
but they were there.
Oh,
They
yeah.
went to Carver, then went to Edison. Amazing.
Yes. Well, they had some famous football players that came out of there, and I think it was Charles Young brought his ring back and showed all the kids in his Super Bowl ring when he played with the 49ers over there. And they had monuments on the school dedicated to these folks, and unfortunately some of them got lost or destroyed when they built Gaston. And so it lost some of the contact with that. But John and I were doing projects again, doing video stories with Hmong children who were coming into Fresno at the time, and their ancestors, and African American students, and World War II veterans that were in the community. And so John and I had been working together on developing this concept of how do you take what you learn and put it out in the community where you can change people's lives or be involved in changing lives. Kind of the same thing I grew up with in Kansas. John was doing the same thing. And so we got together, we formed a charter school that practiced those same things.
Which school?
It's called ACEL, A-C-E-L. Unfortunately, the school didn't last as long as we hoped it would because of financial reasons. But those same principles we carried on as we started Civic Education Center. I went back and got my doctorate degree at Fresno State, and John said, let's do this Civic Education Center thing. And I said, what is it, John? And he said, you'll love it. That's all I need from him, right? So we were doing it, and we go into schools, public schools, and we take U.S. history, primarily with 5th, 8th, and 11th grade, because they teach U.S. history, right? And we go in, and the state frameworks and curriculum standards for California say that in 5th, 8th, and 11th grade, they're supposed to be talking about civics, U.S. history, and how that impacts their community. Most of the times they come up with these ethereal projects that they never get done in the community, or they come up with a cardboard bulletin thing and say, this is what we read about. We take it another level. We say, let's talk about where you're at. What concerns you about your community and about your neighborhood? And we begin to teach them that this is an American value to care. And most of them, when you start talking about American values, they say, what? Most of them don't stand for the flag salute, right? And so it's this concept that's totally foreign to them. Here they are in this country that people all over the world want to come into. They're enjoying some of the greatest values of freedom in the world, and they have no concept of what it is. So we go in and we take U.S. history, these ideas of the founding fathers who were flawed men who messed up in a lot of ways, but gave us some God-guided principles to make this a more perfect union, to make it better with each generation. And so we teach those students that democracy is messy, because you're bringing a bunch of people together who are not perfect to try and come to an agreement to how to govern and rule each other with harmony, right? But it's messy. It's a messy process. So don't give up on it. Engage in the mess. And then once we get them to that point, we talk about your communities, your neighborhood. Where's the mess in your neighborhood? What is it that you desire to see different or change? What is it in your school? What is it in your world that you're concerned about? The interesting thing about this is that all these students, 5th, 8th, and 11th graders, want to talk about it, but there's no time in school, right? No. Because they're dealing with standardized testing, they're dealing with social issues on how to get along. Do I look right? Is there a pimple on my face? You know, am I being bullied? Social media issues. They're dealing with that, and the teachers don't have the time to allow them to engage in issues that are very important to them. Issues of self-esteem, of worth, of immigration, of abortion, of sanctity of life, of discrimination, of race. Those issues are on kids' minds because they're faced with them daily. And in this day of social media, they're surrounded by 24/7, and there's no place for them to get answers or to talk about it in an authoritative fashion. And the research they do online just points them to issues that just confirm stereotypes or popular opinion, but doesn't allow them to delve deep and begin to look at both sides and to question in a democracy, how can we bring these sides together and create a more perfect union?
So since the school setting isn't exactly allowing the time, how do you and John work out the venue for having these 5th, 8th, and 11th graders get the stuff done?
Oh, it's very cool.
So how does that work?
It's very simple because they know they're required to do it by the state according to the standards and the framework. So we go in and we say, let's show you how to do this. We're going to train you so that you'll know how to take the concerns of students, hear them, difficult conversations, teach about the ethics of having dialogue, of listening, hearing, and responding, take messy issues, have a consensus in your classroom with it, and tie it into your standards. And so we go in and train teachers how to do it. So as we're working with students, we have the teachers that we're actually training to give them a chance to do what we're doing. And so it doesn't become an add-on. It's not something extra they're doing. It just flows with their curriculum in these U.S. history classes for 5th, 8th, and 11th graders. And they get a project, and the new textbooks now have a little corner in the textbook of a project that you can do in your community related to the lesson. But most of those projects are like the old storyboard things. We go in and say, this is how you make it real. You want to talk about animal cruelty? We bring in experts that we know to talk to 5th graders about spading and neutering animals and taking care of them. And they hear the experts, and the experts point them to resources where they delve in and they look at this stuff and they research it and they say, oh my, it isn't fair things need to change. So then they begin talking as fifth graders.
They do.
How do we change it, right? And so it goes everything from changing policy to raising money to creating websites for animal protection. And all of a sudden, the thing they talked about in history is not dead, it's alive. It's exciting to them.
So on May 13th, I saw the fruit of that.
You did.
I saw these moments, 10 minutes, in which they summed up something. It was very engaging.
Yes.
And now I know what was the process by which they came to it.
Yes.
You and John and your team facilitate the teachers
Yes.
to get something out of kids that they've got, but if you're not there, it ain't going to happen. It really won't.
Right. Well, we're hoping and we're training. We're kind of like doing this discipleship thing. So that in 3 years, they'll take over and do it. But I hear what you're saying. Because we're there, we open their eyes to a way to make it possible so they're not so blinded and focused just on how do I get this done for the test, but how do I include my children, my students, in changing their world? How do I tap in to those key things in social emotional learning that are beyond the test? And we know from the last 15 years of testing in California, our test scores plateaued. Now, we've always had this achievement gap with students of color, Black and Latino students. Never got very far. And I remember Jack O'Connell once said, he said, the achievement gap is a racial issue, not just an academic issue. We're finding out now that that racial issue is related to social emotional learning of students. And if you can get students to feel comfortable where they are, have a place to express the things going on in their neighborhood in a constructive way, all of a sudden you begin to break through some of those achievement issues and you give students a way to deal with themselves. How do I deal with my emotions when the police have been at my house every day for the last week, our water's cut off, we have no lights, and I'm expected to come to school and learn? Well, those are strong emotions in a student. And if you give them a place to understand how to express that and that you're okay, and you still have a voice, you're still empowered to go into the mess and make a difference, then they function better in school, their learning improves, right? Their behavior improves. And so you have all these things connected to social emotional learning that goes beyond just a civics lesson. It delves into what makes our country real, what makes democracy real. If we can live in community with our mess individually and deal with my mess and deal with your mess corporately, then we can form a more perfect union and build a stronger government.
So I was so excited when I saw the way you focused the topic that you really wanted to work with, civic education, race, and equity.
Yes.
So we dipped into race.
Yes.
But now share even more, Steve, about what would be the equity element that I really think I'm seeing it over and over.
Yes.
We have such a disparity of coverage for people, for levels that will allow them to reach, and the gap that is economic, but basically racial and gender-based.
Yes. Yes.
Can you tell us how you work with equity and race and racism that's rampant in our society, even in this country,
oh my goodness,
even in this city, even in our schools?
Yes. Well, we know race and gender bias are social constructs. If they're social constructs, people created them, people can change them. So once you begin to teach personal responsibility that connects to social responsibility, you can change the construct. Maybe it's as basic as changing the argument of that construct from one is less than to we're all equal. Equality is the first step. It's not equity. It's like I invite you in this room and we're all here. Equity, as my professor, Dr. Ken Magdaleno, used to say, equity is coming to the table and we're eating the same meal, right? Now we're on the same level. We have the same stuff. We look at each other in the eyes, sharing the same resources with that. That's what equity is all about. I can give you equal protection under the law. And this was the whole thing of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Equal under the law, but I don't have to treat you socially like you're my equal. You have your own theaters, your own water fountains, you have this, but we will never be socially equal, right? And our nation has always struggled with that. Even our founding fathers struggled with that, particularly with African Americans.
Oh my God.
Thomas Jefferson had no clue on how to treat these human beings. Were they just God's creatures who were gifted but dim-witted, was his own words? Are they special and gifted as we are? He had no idea how to deal with the issue of blacks in America, nor our founding fathers. At some point, it was this idea, we can't deal with them, let's send them back to Africa, right? And by this time, you had over 100 years of African Americans being here in this country. It was difficult for some to go back to Liberia and try to function there. Even though you had movements by Marcus Garvey and others, that movement of going back to Africa didn't satisfy this desire of blacks and black history to be considered equal. Frederick Douglass, who fought strongly for the abolitionists, right, got frustrated, with America and say, you celebrate 4th of July, but I have to mourn. It represents your freedom, but it still confirms my slavery. So that idea of when will we be equal and when will we have equity has reverberated through our nation's history the moment we first brought black slaves from Africa to this continent. And then it reflected in Native Americans, and then it reflected in how we treat women. So we see no end of this idea of superiority, and understandably, you had whites escaping England for religious freedom who wanted to come and express that, who then didn't offer that same freedom. Now, the Quakers did, and there were some Catholics who did too at the time.
But so few.
So few. But they pushed the abolitionist movement because even though the Constitution and our government allowed for 3/5 of a person in slavery, it also provided a mechanism for states to end it. And so as the abolitionist movement grew and the tension in the country grew, it led to the Civil War. And that tension was fostered by people who believed that God had created all men equal. So we go back, we tap into this. Okay, if it's true then in 1865, where we go to war over it, nearly destroy each other, and though we don't fulfill the promise, and we have to do it again in 100 years later in 1960s, right? Then it's true today. When do we give equal the first step to provide equality for all, so that we can all sit at the same table and say, we're feasting and now let's support each other. So this is what we talk about with students, and we make it practical so that they begin to see the differences. We did a thing with a middle school here in Fresno, where we had Latino students, white students, and African American students line up against the wall in the back and take 2 steps forward if you've experienced any of these things. The first question was, have you had your lights shut off in your house in the last month? The Latino students, African American students step forward. We advance with questions like that till we get to one, did the police come to your door and arrest anyone? Again, Latino, African American students, white students around the back. So then we stopped and had the students turn around and face each other. This is what social injustice looks like. Where we have people who have experienced these things that have separated them and made them feel less and unimportant. But our job is to correct the social injustice. Now, what can we do as middle schoolers to make our brothers and sisters feel, despite all this neglect, police, social violence, locked into West Fresno through redlining over the decades, no ability to build wealth? How do we make them feel accepted, with us and include them so there is no division? So those are the things we talk about in democracy. But that's what democracy is all about.
Yeah. Now, one thing we did want to make sure we left a little time.
Okay.
Constitution Day.
Oh my goodness,
because you're going to be having a big event coming up in September. Tell us about it, date it, and tell us what's going to happen. And then I'm going to ask something, a curveball question. But go ahead.
Oh, okay, very good. Constitution Day, September 17th. Fresno State, we're working with Jim Boren, former editor for the Bee, Andy Fiala, head of ethics department at Fresno State, the mentoring program there at Fresno State, to bring together college students and high school students to talk about the Constitution today. Little simple things will be happening, like Jim has an event where you get a free taco, if you can respond to what are the first 5 guarantees in the First Amendment for college students and high school students, right? And then we're going to have teams of high school students come and participate in it from selected high schools, because this is our first year doing this on this level. So we have some selected teams coming in that will compete in a Constitution, a multiple choice question on the Constitution.
Oh my God.
But also an essay question on the Constitution. And their essay is going to be judged by a judge here in town and 2 African American citizens and a Latino citizen who will be participating in this event to judge the value of what the students say. And then the Manufacturing Council is going to give students awards for their participation in this event. So that's September 17th. We're real excited about it. It's going to be a great opportunity to bring together Fresno State high school students, our community, the business community, to talk about our Constitution and how to keep it real in the mess we're experiencing today.
You mentioned mess. I'm going to pick up on mess, okay? Let's talk about something that on the day that we're recording the program today, on the 11th of July, is an issue that's gone back and forth within the last 2 weeks. The citizenship question.
Yes.
Since citizenship is such an important word,
Yes.
tell us how you're thinking your students and the community is dealing with the idea of including the citizenship question in our census, which is so important. Talk to us about how is the public, do you think, responding to this? Where is equity in this? Where is race in this? Where is civic education in this?
I think that's the heart of it, the citizenship question. But we're not talking to each other. We're talking at each other. And we're throwing slogans and pet words at people rather than hearing and engaging in the process. We know that having citizenship in this country, in the 1790s, some of the first citizenship questions were racial in oriented in order to define white males as citizens of the United States, in order to get the privilege granted in this country. That later changed, with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, the right for women to vote, began to expand. So we see the citizenship issue in our country following our discussions on race and gender expanding, as long as we're willing to engage in dialogue. When we don't engage in dialogue, then you have people set up camps, throw bricks at each other, and say, I'm right and you're wrong. And it destroys this whole idea of being civic towards one another and working towards a common compromise. Citizenship will always be an issue to some because it makes others feel excluded. To others, it gives privilege. So how do you take a privilege and this feeling of exclusion and bring it together to form a more perfect union? That's what we should be talking about, and not being divided along racial lines, because it's not just Latinos coming in from south of the border, but there are folks coming in from African countries who may not have had the education that some of us desire here to make them successful in our predominantly white society, but who'd want to come in too. What is citizenship there? Or a group of Christians who were denied access from the Middle East to come in this country because they were suffering religious persecution. So those are questions we always have to deal with, and democracy is a mess. So let's listen to the mess and engage and not walk away and pout and say, well, I'm just here and I'm just there.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen Morris. We've used up every second we could. We'll have you back and continue where we left off.
I love it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.